If you're a paid member for last year, I have it in the back room. Did you get yours? Yeah, got yours back in the back. Okay. Anyway, I'll bring those out and put them out. I just didn't get a chance to do it. Okay, I'm going to.
I've also increased it. We also, whatever help people can offer for an hour or 30 minutes on April 6th.
Correct. Our mini archaeology expo. We're holding that on April 6th, and we need help. We need volunteers to do all kinds of things, set up tables and break some of the participants and sit in their booths for them, make sure there's all kinds of water. So we need some volunteers. If you're interested in helping us on the day, see Carlos. He'll take down your name. Who's in charge of volunteers? George? You're in charge of volunteers. Okay. George. See George. If you're really interested, and we'll have that day, we'll have all the spots marked out so you can come and help set up tables that day also. Okay. Anything else?
People on can hear.
Oh.
Feedback.
Ask for feedback. Hi, everybody. Can you unmute yourself and tell me if how the sound is going? Franco, you're a good one. Is it going good?
Yep, sound is good.
Okay.
Sound is working.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Tisdale, test.
Test. Is that working okay?
I know it's working okay from here. Can you guys hear it all right?
Yep.
All right, super. All right. In the first half of the 20th century, the canyons and mesas of the Southwest beckoned the whole huge field of archaeology, and it thrived. Among those who heeded the call, Marjorie Lambert became one of the only handful of women who not only left their imprint on the study of Southwestern archaeology and anthropology, but it flourished. Award winner author Dr. Shelby Tisdale's new book, No Place for a Lady, is the life story of Marjorie Lambert, who provides a glimpse into a time when there were few women establishing full-time careers in anthropology, archaeology, or museums. Dr. Tisdale takes you on a thought-provoking journey into how Lambert created a successful and satisfying professional career and a personal life in the place she loved, the American Southwest. Now, do you want to just think, where do you want to? You want to be up on the stage, or?
No, I think I could probably do it right from here. Everybody can see me here, and hopefully everyone out there in Zoom land can see me okay. Well, now I'm in the dark, but that's okay. But that's all right. That's perfectly fine. I'm probably going to walk around a little bit, so I think maybe if we turn the lights off, we'll be fine, because I'm. I don't know. What do you think? Should I go up to the podium, or?
It's up to you. I mean, if you want to walk around, it's easier for you. Just remember.
Yeah. I think I'll just walk around a little bit, and then you're gonna let me.
You'll tell me
when I need to move forward on a slide. Great. First of all, before I start, I would like to just acknowledge the ancestral lands that we are currently on. These are the homelands of descendant communities today who do consider this to be their ancestral homelands. And I just want to respectfully acknowledge that before I start. So I'm going to just start off a little bit about who Marjorie is and how I got to know her a little bit. let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Forward here, let's see.
Not moving. Yeah, I think I'm gonna need it.
A second here, let's see which switch it is.
Oh, let's hit enter. No,
Should be.
it should be this one. Go for it. Not working. Yeah, I tried that one.
Yeah,
we're
doing the arrows.
Oh, got it.
Okay,
It is
great.
the up and down arrow.
Okay, so I thought what I would do first is give you a little background on how I met Marjorie Lambert. In the early 1980s, I was working on my master's thesis, and I had just finished my coursework at the University of Washington in Seattle in museum studies, and I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I was able to get a job at the School of American Research, where I was working in the Indian Art Research Center. And shortly after I started working there, I was asked to go over to the Lambert home, which was just across the street and up the road a little bit from the school, to help pack up their Indian art collection. They had a collection of pottery, baskets, gorgeous jewelry, just an amazing collection. And they were getting ready to move out of their home. Jack Lambert was 11 years older than Marjorie, and he was pretty much by that point in time had lost most of his hearing. He was in his 90s, he was losing his balance, and Marjorie was no longer able to pick him up when he fell and things like that. So they decided that probably they needed to get him somewhere where people could care for him a little better than she could. At the same time, she was losing her eyesight. So it was like this double kind of situation where they were just not able to take care of each other anymore. So they decided to provide their collection on loan to the School of American Research until they could then, for tax purposes, donate the collection over time. So I went over to their home to pack up this incredible collection and take it back over to the Indian Art Research Center. So next slide. So that's how I met her. I also would go and I would pick her up and bring her back and forth to the School of American Research for meetings. She was at that point currently on the board of directors. She was also on the collections committee at the Indian Art Research Center. She also liked to come in for our lectures, and what we had were brown bag lunches where we would bring in different scholars to do lectures during lunch. So I would go over to her apartment and transport her for these meetings. Well, during these meetings or during this transportation times, she often would comment about her eyesight and how it was getting worse and worse all the time. And she was really having a difficult time reading, especially archaeology journals and books and things like that. So what I did was I offered to go over on Wednesday nights after work and read to her. And we would have dinner often before we'd sit down to read. We'd either have a little something to eat at her house. She'd fix something. I would oftentimes do takeout and take it over to her house. Sometimes we would even go out to Tomasita's in Santa Fe and have maybe a margarita and a chicken enchilada or something. But she really enjoyed having, oops, we went too far, didn't we?
I did, I'm sorry.
That's okay, oops, there we go. So, so I would go over and I would read to her. And the first book that I read was New Light on Chaco Canyon. It had just literally come out from the School of American Research. And it was an edited volume by David Noble. And it was just this current research on Chaco Canyon. And it was fabulous to be able to sit and read this to her. I had a background in Southwest archaeology, and I had subsequently gone into more of the museum studies perspective. But at that time, it was so much fun to read archaeology to her. I would read American Antiquity, other journals, and then sometimes we would just read books, just depending on what she wanted to read. And one of the books I read to her was Blackberry Winter about Margaret Mead. She also had a fascination with gorillas and primates, and so I would read to her things about Jane Goodall or Diana Fossey, whatever she wanted to have read to her, I would read. And during these reading sessions, she would talk a little bit about growing up and what it was like to be an archaeologist back in the 1930s, especially a woman archaeologist, and the difficulties that she had. And I had started out in archaeology in the mid-1970s, and I realized a lot of the kinds of issues that she dealt with, had dealt with similar issues myself. And so what I started to realize, we had all of this commonality. The other thing is she had a 32-year career in museums after her doing so much of the archaeology. And I was doing the same thing. I was working towards a career in museums. Next slide. So then in 1989, I came to the University of Arizona in Tucson to work on my doctorate. And when I first started there, I was able to work with Dr. Nancy Parizo as a research assistant. And Nancy and Barbara Babcock had done a project back in the mid-1980s called Daughters of the Desert, and it focused on women in anthropology, and especially during the turn of the century and early 1900s. And Marjorie Lambert was one of the women included in this project. And they also had, in 1986, they had a conference here in Arizona with all of these women who were still alive, and had scholars presenting papers on a number of these women. And so the result of that, and they also had an exhibit that traveled around the country called Daughters of the Desert, which was accompanied by the catalog on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is a book that I worked on with Nancy Parizo, and it's called Hidden Scholars, and it was the compilation of all of the conference papers from that Daughters of the Desert conference. And it was during this time that I talked a lot to Nancy about so many of these women. We don't know anything about them, and they made all these major contributions to anthropology and archaeology and the sciences, and just never received any kind of recognition. And so that was one of the primary reasons of getting the Hidden Scholars volume out. But also during that time, I had the opportunity to make a contribution to this volume. And I talked about the popularization of anthropology and archaeology that was based on a lot of the work that women did, and it was not recognized by the Academy. And so the more we talked, I talked about my relationship with Marge Lambert, and she said, "You should do a biography on Marjorie." And I said, "Oh, I don't know. I don't know if she would let me." So during the summer times, I would go back to Santa Fe, and I would visit with Marge, and I asked her one day if she would let me write her biography. And of course, she was very humble, and she said, "No, I didn't do anything." I'm like, "Are you kidding me? You did all kinds of things. We need to record this. This needs to be, at least if I don't write the book, at least recorded." So I had the opportunity over the years while I was in grad school to keep going back to Santa Fe to do these oral histories on her, and I was able to record them. And I had over 40 hours of recorded oral history on Marjorie. But I also had the opportunity to record a number of her colleagues who were still alive at that point. And so it was a rich, very, very rich group of scholars that I was able to interview. Next slide. So who is Marjorie? Who is Marjorie? She was born Marjorie Ferguson, and she was born in 1908 in Colorado Springs. Her mother's side of the family were early pioneers to Colorado. They settled primarily, first of all, in the Leadville area and then moved to Colorado Springs. Her father came straight from Scotland and was quite a scholar, was quite a well-educated man. Both his parents died early, so he was raised by his grandmother. And he went to college for a little bit, not a long time. He didn't graduate, but he did get some college education before coming to the United States. He settled into Colorado Springs because there was a large Scottish community in Colorado Springs at the time. A lot of Scottish pioneers settled into the Colorado Springs area very early on in the 1800s. So next. So during her high school years, as I said, her family was fairly well educated. Her parents were well educated, and she would go off oftentimes into her grandfather's library. And her grandfather was another very well educated man on her mother's side, and he had all kinds of different books. And she came across a book when she was about 14, 15 on Egyptology. And she just thought, oh, I'm going to be an Egyptologist. I'm going to do archaeology in Egypt. So that kind of got her on this road. And then in high school, she would go to the library all the time and bring home books to read. She came across these books on Southwest archaeology. And one in particular that she found very interesting was one by A.B. Kidder, who certainly is a well-known Southwest archaeologist. And then she also came across a book by Sylvanus G. Morley. And Sylvanus Morley was a Mesoamerican archaeologist. He worked primarily in Mayan sites down in Guatemala and in the Yucatan. So she graduated from high school in 1926. She also, at one point, was placed in the Alumni Hall of Fame, which was in 1995. And she was just so humbled by this and was really amazed, because it's usually the kinds of people that make it into Alumni Hall of Fames are usually big athletes and things like that. And here she was, this little archaeologist, and she was just really pleased to have been included in this. Next slide, please. Well, and so then when she graduated, she went to Colorado College, which is in, of course, Colorado Springs. Her parents, this was during the Depression, and so it was at the very beginning of the Depression. Money was tight, so her parents really wanted all three of the kids. She had two siblings, a brother and a sister, to be well educated, to get college educations, but they couldn't afford to send any of their children out of state or even out of town to go to college. So all three of them went to Colorado College there in Colorado Springs, and she attended Colorado College from 1926 to 1930, and she studied social anthropology and sociology, which were two. Sociology in particular was one of the fields that young women went into at that point in time. They were either going to be teachers, librarians, or social workers. Those were kind of the three main occupations for young women at that point in time. Well, while she was there, her professors would invite archaeologists to come and speak to her classes. And one of the archaeologists that came up was Edgar Hewitt. And at that point in time, Hewitt was the director, well, actually, he was the founder and director of the School of American Research, the Museum of New Mexico, and he founded the University of New Mexico's Anthropology Department. So he was a really well-known figure in Southwest archaeology by then. And he would come up and give lectures on Southwest archaeology to these students. And oftentimes Sylvanus Morley, remember, he was the Mesoamerican archaeologist, would come with him. And they would both come and they would both give lectures. Oftentimes they would go to private homes and meet people and give talks there. And I'm sure part of that was kind of fundraising for Hewitt in particular to help support his organizations and institutions that he was founding. But it was during this time that Marjorie met both of these incredible men, and especially Edgar Lee Hewitt would play a huge role in her life. Next. When she graduated in 1930, she had applied to a number of different universities to go to graduate school. Many of them were in New York, some were in Colorado, but primarily New York was where she was kind of had her sights at that point in time. And then Hewitt convinced her to come to New Mexico and go to the University of New Mexico. And so she decided to go ahead and take up his offer because he was offering her a full scholarship. And so then her parents wouldn't have to pay, you know, for her tuition and fees and so on. She wouldn't have to be finding a place to live. She'd be living in the dorms and so on. So it worked out really well for her. So she got on a train. She went down to Albuquerque. She got off the train, and her mother, she had $26 in her pocket. And her mother said, just stay at the YWCA and then go to the university the next morning and you know, meet up with the folks going out to the field school. So she went out, she got off the train. She couldn't find the WYCA. So she just asked somebody, you know, where's the university? And they just pointed up there and way up in the hills. And so she just started walking. And as she was going, she just found a little for rent sign out in front of a house, room for rent. And she went up, and this lady, elderly lady, had a room that she was renting. And so she rented that room for the night. And then early the next morning went on up to the university. Got together with the group, threw her bedroll and everything in the back end of the truck, and got up on the back of the truck, and off they went to Battleship Rock. This was a field camp that was located in the Jemez Mountains, just outside of Jemez Springs. And her first year, she worked at a site called Unchagi. And when she got up to the site to start working, she found that no one would teach her how to do archaeology. She had no idea how do you do archaeology. And she was really getting frustrated because the senior boys who were kind of supervising the excavation refused to teach the young women who were there any kind of archaeological techniques. I had this similar kind of experience myself and in Southwest Colorado, and along with other female students. But she met this young Indian boy from Jemez Pueblo, who had been out on these excavations with Edgar Lee Hewitt a couple of times, knew how to excavate. He took Marjorie aside and taught her all the techniques on how to do archaeology. This young man, who was only I want to say young man, he was a boy, he was only 15 years old, became a lifelong friend of Marjorie's. And it was that field experience and that connection that formed a lot of connections that would be part of her life going forward. Next slide. So the next year, the next summer in 1931, what Hewitt would do for his archaeology field schools, the first year students always worked at Battleship Rock. The second year, his more advanced students would work at Chaco Canyon. So she spent the first part of the summer at Battleship Rock working at a site called Nanashagi. And then the second half of the field season, she went out to Chaco Canyon. And so this was a whole new experience for her, because Chaco Canyon, of course, is high desert, whereas the Jemez Mountains, I mean, it was very mountainous, very rocky, very difficult to get to these sites and work in these sites. Whereas, how many of you have been to Chaco Canyon? I bet you all have, right? Just about. Well, it's a very different kind of environment where you have these large pueblos. Next site, or next, sorry. So one of the things, the students, while they were at Chaco Canyon, there was also a trading post right there by Pueblo Bonito. And so at the end of the day, to pass time, the students would go over to the trading post and go through all the old pawn and, you know, buy things. She said one of the things they would buy would be these dried up old prunes that had worms in them, but they ate them anyway because they didn't have a lot of food out at Chaco. And she, one of the things she bought was this what is called a concha belt. I don't know if you can't see it that well in this particular photo, but she bought this belt when she was still in grad school at the University of New Mexico, and it was something that she wore almost every day of her life. Every time I ever saw her, she had this belt on. And this photo is on the cover of the book as well. Next slide. So while she was at the field school, Hewitt decided that if all of the committee members or students might happen to be at the site at any particular time, then that student would have to do their oral exams. Well, one day Marjorie's, all of her committee members were there for her master's, and she was out at the site working, and they called her into the building, which was basically an old Weatherall building out at Chaco, right by Pueblo Bonito. And she said, and he said, well, Marjorie, you're going to have your exam this morning. No time to prepare, no time to study. Just, we're going to give you the exam. So she said she couldn't believe it. She was nervous as all get out. And while she was taking her exam, the Navajo or the Diné who were working in the area and working a lot on these sites, one of them became very ill and they were having a healing ceremony. And part of the healing ceremony included what they called a devil's chase. And it was while she was in taking her exams that this devil chase was going on. And the devil chase is people on horseback chasing this person that is supposed to be the devil. And so they were going around in circles around this building while she was taking her exam. But she thought for sure she was going to fail, but she passed. She did fine. So she passed her orals, and her career was launched. Next slide. When she went back to UNM after finishing her oral exams, and she finished her master's thesis on Isleta Pueblo, she became pretty much a full-time archaeologist. She worked on a number of sites. She was also teaching at UNM. She was teaching archaeology classes and doing these field sites. As I said, she worked at Inshagi and Nanashagi during her field schools. And then at Chaco Canyon, she actually worked at Chaco pretty much every summer through 1935. In 1932, she was sent out to Las Vegas, New Mexico, to what was called New Mexico Normal School at the time, but is now Highlands University. And she taught a summer class that year on archaeology, and then she taught a field school at the Tecolodi site. And Tecolodi was a site that was pretty much starting to erode out of some sides of an arroyo. And so it was really almost like a salvage project that they were working on out there. So she did that in 1932, and then she worked at Quarai, Quawa, Gisiwa, and Pa'ako. Pa'ako today is pretty much covered by housing, but at the time, it was property that was owned by the University of New Mexico. It was a fairly large site. And it was one of these sites that by this time, she had archaeology back at that point in time was not very scientific. And it was really, especially here in the Southwest, it was still pretty amateur, I would say. People in the bigger universities, like at Peabody, at Harvard, things like that, they were Chicago, they were experimenting with a lot of different new techniques and having bigger questions about archaeological sites, other than just going out and collecting artifacts and kind of looking at some of the architecture. They were starting to develop theses and theories and so on about some, and big questions about what they were finding in some of these sites. Next. So here she is at Tekaloti. She had a number of the native crew members that she had worked with at Battleship Rock and at Chaco came from some of the pueblos along the Rio Grande. And so she hired a lot of them to work on her site at Tekaloti. And then some of the others are students that are in her class. Next. And as I said, she worked at Paulrai and Quawa. Quawa is now part of Coronado State Monument. If you've ever been there, it's a huge site. Next. And then of course this was Pa'ako. And I wanted to just get to Pa'ako because this was the site that Marjorie really had some run-ins with Hewitt. She had already by this time been going to conferences and meeting a lot of the archaeologists who were working in the East, who were developing all these theories and so on, and dating techniques. And she was like, and she also met some folks at the University of Arizona who had already been starting to work with dendrochronology and things like that. And so when she took over the Pa'ako site, she was out there on her own. She had her own crew. She hired her own crew. She started asking a lot of these more scientific questions. And so while she was there, she dug this huge trench, and she was trying to figure out the stratigraphy of the site. How many living layers were within that site? And Hewitt came out, who was her boss, came out and was really upset with her because he felt she was wasting her time. He wanted artifacts. He wanted the artifacts for the museum. And he thought what she was doing was senseless. Why do you need to, why is this so important? And so that was when she really became kind of questioning her mentor. Because she was really into the science part of it. That's what fascinated her, not just going and digging up a pot. What she wanted to know was, how old is this site? How many different layers of occupation have been in this site? And who were the people that lived in all these different layers? And where did they come from? These are questions we still ask ourselves today, but we're getting more and more answers because today, we're going out and working more collaboratively with descendant communities. So I think she was doing that at that time. She had so many native workers, people from the surrounding pueblos working for her. When she would find something, she would ask them, "What is this? What am I finding? What do you think of this?" And so she was really at the forefront of ethnoarchaeology and collaborative archaeology. Next slide. But it's that science question that always she was working with. So in 1937, Hewitt brought, after she finished with her work at Pa'ako, Hewitt brought her up to Santa Fe to work in the museum a little bit, to figure out what was going on in the museum. She could learn a little bit. It was during this time that she went to a party and met this fellow named Jack Lambert. And Jack became very smitten with her. And so after this, they went out a couple of times, but he was a little bit older than her. He was 11 years older. And when she went back down to Albuquerque, he would come down to Albuquerque and visit her and take her out to dinner and so on. And finally, she just had to break it off because her mother's advice was, don't date an older man because they're nothing but trouble. I don't know if that's true, but but that's what she was told. And so she decided to heed her mother's advice and just, back off from it. But I have to tell you about their first date. Their first date, Jack picked her up. He was dressed to the nines. He had this a big cowboy hat. He's very tall. He was about 6'4". She's about 5'2", so you can imagine. But he's just this handsome man, just dressed to the nines, pulls up in this, she called it a roadster, and he takes her up to Sankawi, an archaeological site that's outside of what is now Bandelier National Monument. But at that time, Bandelier didn't exist. He takes her out and he takes her up to the site, lays out a blanket, and they have this great picnic lunch. And she finds out about his background. He's a dude. And I want to say a ranch dude. He would take people back in the 1920s. He would take people from the East Coast, from Santa Fe out to the Grand Canyon by horseback. And they would camp the whole way. And I'm talking women and men, turn of the century, up to the 1920s. There wasn't a single fence between Santa Fe and the Grand Canyon. Or he'd take them out to Canyon de Chelly or Chaco, places that were really remote. And that was what he did for a job. He was great at it too, from what I hear. Next slide. So I want to just talk a little bit about some of the other women that were colleagues of Marjorie's. Catherine Bartlett worked with the Coltons at the Museum of Northern Arizona. She went out on a lot on their archaeological sites, and she was the very first woman to become a museum curator in the Southwest. Next slide. Then in 1937, two other women became curators in major museums here in the Southwest. One was Marie Wormington, who's on the left-hand side there. She went to the museum, what was called the Denver Museum of Natural History at the time. It's now the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. But at that time, she was the first paleontologist that they had hired at that museum. And she was a woman. And she had a very, very difficult time throughout her 30-plus year career. She had numerous museum directors who were all males who tried to get her fired or, let her go or come up with some reason, but they could never figure out how to do it because she was so good at what she did. And she was very professional and just at the top of her game. And then Marjorie was another woman who was another one of the first to be appointed as the curator of archaeology at the Museum of New Mexico. See, she's wearing that belt again. You'll see it. Anytime you see her dressed up like that, you'll see her in the belt. Next slide. So she became the curator of archaeology and remained in that position from 1937 to 59. But when she came to the Museum of New Mexico, the exhibits were basically, like you see here, just cabinets of curiosity. Can you remember when you used to go to museums and they'd just be cabinets full of stuff? And there wouldn't be really any interpretation, just maybe there might be a label or two to tell you what you're looking at, but for the most part, it was that you really didn't know that much about it. It might be weapons and it might be utilitarian ware, cooking pots or something like that, but it really didn't tell you much about who made them. Where are they from? Where'd you find these things? So that was one of the things she worked on, was creating what we call today interpretive exhibits. So she created exhibits with themes and so on. She also found the collections were a total mess. We're good. You can stay right where you are. I was going to say, stay where you are. Oops. Whoops.
I keep touching stuff over here.
Well, anyway, she one of the things she did.
I'm going to get back. Oh my goodness.
Wrong direction there.
I'm so sorry.
Well,
Now it's not working.
So she did a lot of different things, also with the collection, because the collection storage areas were a mess. They were not, oops. Oh, okay.
Wait a minute. The problem was I have my hand on the where do I need to go back?
Yeah,
The other way. Okay, I'm going.
there.
Finger off the button.
So, like I said, but also one of the things that Marjorie, in her position, she was de facto secretary of the Archaeological Society of Mexico, which meant, she didn't have just secretarial duties, she also
We
had
lost
to,
the audio.
for example, she had to arrange all of the lectures and so on for, just like for your Archaeological Society here. So she kept very busy, but also because of her duties in the museum, she had no time to go out and do any archaeology. And that was always really frustrating for her. She would go out to visit archaeological sites on the weekends and so on, but she just wasn't able to find the time to get out and actually do archaeological projects. But she did do a lot of writing, and she was one of the few archaeologists who actually wrote about the work that she did at archaeological sites. And so she took a lot of time when she could to write up site reports and to write up articles about different artifacts and so on. And so she wrote in popular magazines. She wrote for American Antiquity. She wrote for professional journals. And then, of course, she did a couple of publications, quite a few publications. And she gave a lot of tours. For her, public education about archaeology was so important. It wasn't just going out and doing archaeology, but it was educating the general public who came into the museum, as well as through her lecture projects, about the importance of archaeology and what we're learning from our archaeological work. So next step. As I said, she was the secretary of the Archaeological Society of New Mexico, but she also was very involved in many, many other organizations. In the Indian Arts Fund, she was on its board for a number of years before that collection was eventually donated to the School of American Research. And that collection, which was started in the 1920s under the Pueblo Pottery Fund, actually became the basis for the collections at the Indian Art Research Center at the SAR. During the war, she volunteered for the Red Cross Motor Corps, and she was interesting because what she would do is there was an Army hospital there in Santa Fe at the time, and she would go over and pick up servicemen who were at least ambulatory, but still healing from whatever wounds they had. She would pick them up and she would take them out to the pueblos for feast days and things like that, and expose so many of these servicemen who were not from the Southwest, but were from the Midwest and other states to the indigenous people here in the Southwest, which was something really unique and different. She also worked with the New Mexico Association on Indian Affairs and the Santa Fe Indian Market. She, especially those two groups in particular, worked really hard to find places for artists coming to the Santa Fe Indian Market to stay, because at first they were just camping out in parking lots. They had really nowhere to sleep, and certainly nowhere to take a shower or any of those kinds of things. So she and those two organizations, she worked very hard with them to find accommodations for the Indian artists coming into town, especially those that were coming from great distances, like the Hopi and the Zuni in particular. And then she worked for the Spanish Colonial Society and numerous others. These are just a couple of the ones she worked with. But she took every one of these very serious, and she was either on their boards or on committees or something along that line. Next slide. In 1956, she finally did actually get to work on an archaeological site. It was right behind her office, as a matter of fact. It was in the courtyard of the patio area of the Palace of the Governors. There were two wells back there, and she really wanted to work at the other well because it was much, much older. And these wells, the other well in particular dated to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. And she thought that would be a really interesting one to excavate because the Pueblo people were actually able to cut off the water to the Spanish who were living in the palace of the governors at the time, right before the revolt. And so she wanted to see just what kind of evidence might be left in that particular well. But she wasn't able to do that one because it was in too much of a public area and the director was concerned that somebody might hurt themselves from the public. So she worked on the second well, and this well, it was interesting. What they found were things more related to the post office that had been there, like ink wells and things like that. It wasn't that exciting. But what was great was she was the one who designed this whole it was like designed so that you could put a pail down and pull things up from down inside the well. And she's the one who designed this whole rig. So I think that was pretty cool for a woman to design this thing. Next. Okay. So and after that, she was like, I really, really want to get out in the field. I want to be doing stuff. And by this time, she's married to Jack Lambert, and that's a story in itself, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes. But before we get there, she was working up at the laboratory of anthropology by then. She was no longer downtown at the palace, and she and Jack would go down to the Boot Heel, which is Hidalgo and Luna counties down in New Mexico, that Boot Heel that kind of slants down, goes down south a little bit. It was an area that had never really been looked at before. I mean, the Mimbres area, more around Silver City and north up in the Gila, that had been worked on a lot, but nobody had really kind of searched around that area. And Jack, of course, being a former dude rancher himself, he knew all these ranchers down in this area. So they would go and visit these ranchers and they'd take them out and show them all the sites that were all around there. And so Marge decided, we really need to do some formal survey and excavation down here. So she put a proposal together for the School of American Research for funding to go down to Hidalgo County in particular. And she did get the funding in 1960 to go down to the area. And they surveyed the area quite extensively, but also they were able to work in 3 different caves. And the one cave, U-Bar Cave in particular, is probably the most famous because that was where they found a hunting hair net made out of human hair, 150 feet long. And so it must have been used, to put across a really large arroyo of some sort to catch fairly large game. And it was all rolled up. And then they found another figure they called it a wooden kachina because they didn't really know what it was. But they took she showed it to Pueblo religious leaders who would come to the museum, or she would take photos of it out to the different Pueblos and ask them what it was. And all of them said, this is not from this area. This is not anything we recognize. It's wrong colors. It's not from this particular area. So in my research, and I've conferred this with some colleagues, we think this is more of what they call a Tlaloc figure. And a Tlaloc figure is from Mesoamerica. It's a Mesoamerican figure. So it was during this particular time period of working in these sites, these caves, but in particular U-Bar Cave, that Marjorie came up with the theory that these caves were had some representation of either people from Mesoamerica coming up to the Southwest, and this is where they were having their ceremonies or something, or they were trading. But they decided, because of some of the other things they found in this cave, that it was probably some sort of a ceremonial cave. But it had all of this relationship between the Southwest and Mesoamerica. So she was one of at the forefront of that. Charles de Peso from the Ameren Foundation was another one who was an advocate for this Mesoamerican Southwest connection. And of course, she was a very good colleague of Charles de Peso. So it makes sense that she would come up with this kind of thought as well. Next slide. As I said, she liked to go to different conferences, and this is where she would connect with so many of her colleagues throughout the Southwest, but also throughout the country. And one of her favorite conferences was the Pecos Conference. How many of you go to the Pecos Conference? It's a wonderful conference, and I've been going to it myself since probably the early 1980s. And when her site, this was the last Pecos conference she was able to go to, and that's because by this time her eyesight was getting so bad. She was almost 100% blind and trying to walk on the rough ground and so on, because during the Pecos conference, you're usually camped out, you know, in the middle of nowhere in a forest somewhere, and the ground can be pretty tricky, even for the sighted. So this was the last one. At this point, I was living in Taos, New Mexico, and I came down to Santa Fe, and I picked her up, and we went out to Pecos for the conference. And Helga Tewis from the University of Arizona snapped this photo of us together, and I'm so glad she did. But that was one of the things I think for Marjorie, because she felt like, because she was so in tune to New Mexico's archaeology and Santa Fe and so on, almost felt parochial. And going to these conferences and meetings got her out and got her into the world of archaeology outside of her little box. Next. Next slide.
Hold on.
There we go. Now, Jack, I want to just share just a few minutes. I started to run out of time. Just a little bit about Jack. You know, I mentioned that he was a dude, but he's, by the time she really met him, he was working on the, what we call the White Estate, which is now the land, the property that the School for Advanced Research is on today, that campus. Jack saw Marjorie in 1949. He was in the grocery store and he happened to see Marjorie and realized he was still very smitten with her. And so he went across the street and he asked the secretary in the art museum, who was a friend of his, so what's the status of Marjorie? And she said, I don't think she's married or anything. I never see her with a husband. So he started to check it out, and it turns out she was still married. She got married to a young man she met at that Tecolote Field School in 1932. And they stayed married all these years, but they never lived together because shortly after they got married, she realized he was a heavy drinker. He wasn't good at keeping a job, and just decided, you know, I don't need this in my life. So she just kind of went off on her own. And at that point in time, she had the last name Tichy. And that's when she published a lot of her articles and so on during that time period. She still used the name Tichy. But Jack found out that she was still married and decided to get in touch with her husband, and he paid this fellow off to get a divorce from Marge. So then he started courting Marge, and then they got married in 1950. And they had a wonderful marriage together. It was, Jack had already been married, somebody said 6 times before he met Marge.
Oh, gee.
Yeah. So he wasn't very successful at marriages himself. But when the two of them got together, they were so, what she would call simpatico. they were the perfect pair. And he loved archaeology. He wasn't an archaeologist himself, but he loved the archaeology. He supported her 100%. He loved museums. He loved all the Native American artists and Hispano artists and friends that they had throughout their years together. And they both had such mutual respect for each other. And I hear they had some pretty wild parties up at their house too. As a matter of fact, one of the main house where they lived is now a scholar residence for the School for Advanced Research, where scholars come for 9 months, and they have a house to live in and a stipend and so on. I went into that house this past summer because I went up to give a talk, and it was in front of that house, and one of the bullet holes is still in one of the big beams that goes across the living room. I mean, they would roll up the carpet, they would dance, they would have a good time. There were stories about their parties even in the early 1980s when I was living in Santa Fe. Of course, they were no longer having these parties, but she talks about some of them in the book. But they had a wonderful life together. Next slide.
Oh, come on.
Has a mind of its own.
Oh, it does.
But they, they did a lot of things together, and supported each other.
I'm so sorry. Darn computers.
Sometimes they cooperate, sometimes they don't.
Well, I keep pushing the button, hoping it'll work. Oh. Okay, hang on just a minute. Just a minute. Now I gotta push the other button.
Okay. So Marge passed away in 2006. And by this time I was in Santa Fe. I was the director of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture at the time. And she was living at El Castillo, which is a retirement home. And I was so fortunate that I was able to write chapters, and I would take them over to her and I would read them to her, and she would comment on them. She would edit, she would change some things. Oh dear. Well, darn. Well, anyway, when she passed away, I have to say she was 98 years old, and she often said, Shelby, are you ever going to finish this book? Because I don't know if I'm going to make it to 100. But I finally finished this book last year. Well, I finally finished it during COVID. And it was my COVID project to get it off the shelf and finally finish it up. And the University of Arizona Press published it last June. And I have to say,
Sorry, guys.
I'm just so excited to have this story out there. She was a wonderful storyteller herself. And the way I designed the book was so that essentially all those recordings that I did, I had them all transcribed. I was able to take quotes from those video or those tape recordings and create her story, but then create the history, a story about the history of the development of Southwest archaeology around her life story, because she was so instrumental in it. And also I really wanted her specific contributions to the field of archaeology, especially here with some of the sites that she worked at. I wanted to bring those out as well. So it's not just a biography about a woman, but it's also a good story about some of the early luminaries in Southwest archaeology, if that's something that is of interest to you as well. And the role, the politics and all the stuff that went on in Santa Fe with the museums and Hewitt and all of that's all in this book. So one of the things that I think with Marjorie, she was a great mentor to me, but she was also a great mentor to so many other young people. And she was a great colleague for both male as well as female colleagues. She had to put up with a lot of issues. Pay equity was a huge issue. She never, ever made the kind of salary that her male colleagues did, even though she was doing more work or doing the same work. You know, it's still what happens today. And back then, when she would complain about her pay, because she would have to take her own money to get the trowel sharpened, to get bags to take out to the field, all of those. She didn't have a supply fund. I mean, she had to pay for all of it. And, you know, she wasn't making very much money. Things didn't cost what they did back then, but do now. But it was still tough. And oftentimes her peers, her male peers in particular, would say, well, if you don't like it, go find a rich man and marry him, was kind of the answer. And I think for women back then, there was a lot of sexual discrimination going on as well. And women back then put up with it, because if they objected to it or said anything or did anything, they would just lose their jobs. And there weren't a lot of jobs for women back then, especially in the profession and especially in academia. I mean, women who were, Marge was very fortunate. She was able to get a position in the museum, but, and she was teaching at UNM, and she probably could have kept on teaching for a while, but she wouldn't have advanced. She would always have been a lecturer and never been advanced to an assistant professor or an associate professor or even a professor. So, and part of that was because she didn't have a PhD. And the reason she didn't get her PhD was because Edgar Lee Hewitt wanted her to go to Southern California University, which he was just starting to build an anthropology department. She didn't want to go there because it had no recognition. Of course, it does now. I mean, USC is a great university, but back then it was unknown. People didn't know anything about it. And she was like, well, I didn't want to go there and just be an experiment, you know. It was like, she was smart enough to know that she probably, if she went there and got her PhD, she probably couldn't get a job because nobody had heard of it, right? So she had a lot of smarts, I have to tell you. Okay, next slide. Let's see if we can wrap this up. Okay, so just a lot of thank yous. Certainly want to thank the Santan Archaeological Society for inviting me here tonight. This is wonderful. But also just, I had so many people that helped me out with photos, with archival information, documents. Family members were wonderful and providing all kinds of things for me. Next slide. There we go. Okay, so the books, I do have a couple of books tonight if you're interested. And for those of you who are joining us out there in Zoom land, if you're interested in purchasing a book, you can go to the University of Arizona Press. I put their address up here, their web address. You could also go to Amazon or even Barnes and Noble, or I would say your local bookstore. I always like to support those local bookstores, and you know, you wouldn't have to pay any shipping on it either if you got it through your local bookstore, which is always nice. So anyway, thank you very much. Let's see, do you have any questions? Yes, oops. I have a question over here. Yeah. Yes, sorry.
When she started, she said that mentor was wealthy for, you know, having funds to hire people. Not hire his own crew for these activities.
Is it turned on?
And then you said that our young native taught her how to do that. And then she formed her own team. How did she finance that team? Because as you said, she earned scholarship. She had no other, I guess, income.
Right. Well, when Hewitt would do his, for example,